The idea that there's a central authority that can distinguish true from false, that can ex cathedra on high say, these ideas are true, these ideas are false, and if you disagree, then you're a heretic. You're to be censored and socially put down, excommunicated even. That is a dangerous idea. Essentially, it's the return to a dark age.
Did lockdowns mark the end of the Enlightenment era? 2 years after the Great Barrington Declaration, I sat down with one of its eminent authors, Dr. Bhattacharya, professor at Stanford University Medical School, a physician, epidemiologist, health economist, and public health expert. We discussed the immense harms and collateral damage of lockdowns, the crushing censorship of scientific debate and scapegoating of perceived opponents, the deification of science, and the philosophical underpinnings of our societal response. If you enjoy this podcast, make sure to check it out on Apple, Spotify, Google, or subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And you can also check out AIER's new YouTube channel here. Okay, well, great. I'm so happy to be here with you, finally speaking, not in person, but at least across this medium, which has blown up throughout the last 2.5 years. So welcome to the show, Jay Bhattacharya.
Thank you, Kate. Pleasure to be here.
Awesome. So today is actually the second anniversary of the Great Barrington Declaration, which was written by 3 fringe epidemiologists, according to Francis Collins and Anthony Fauci. You guys have really been through the ringer. You've been smeared. You've been censored by big tech. You've really put your necks out in order to defend public health principles that have been long withstanding. And so I'd just like to talk about that and a whole bunch of other things. So maybe you can start with explaining the Great Barrington Declaration, how it came to be, and what you expected to be the response to that.
Sure. So the Great Barrington Declaration, it's a very simple idea. It's basically a articulation of the old pandemic plan. The idea is that you identify who's at most high risk, the vulnerable, and then focus protection on them. And for the rest of society, attempt to disrupt and panic as little as possible, because the disruption itself causes more harm than good to health, to well-being. So that's the basic idea of the Great Barrington Declaration. It's in many ways the least original thing I've ever worked on. I aspire as a scientist to write, I hope, original ideas and get them published in journals. But ironically, the thing that I've worked on in my career that's resonated the best is probably the least original of thing I've ever done. But that's actually not bad. I mean, the purpose of the Great Barrington Declaration really was to tell the world that the lockdown-focused strategy we had been following was a bad mistake, that it was a deviation from the old pandemic plan that had worked for dealing with respiratory viral pandemics for a century. It started, basically, my friend Martin Kulldorff rang me up one evening in September and said, Jay, I'm organizing a little conference in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, and would you be willing to come? And I'm like, when is it? Oh, it's in a week and a half. I'm like, okay, whatever Martin says, I'm willing to do. And he'd invited Sunetra Gupta from Oxford University, who I respected deeply, but I'd never had met before. So I jumped at the chance. When the plan was to invite some journalists and us and the 3 of us, and we would have a little mini tutorial press conference where we tell journalists about what infectious disease epidemiology really was about. When we arrived, we decided that we were going to write something about what our thoughts were on how to manage the pandemic. It turns out we arrived basically from 3 slightly different angles at the same place. The idea of focus protection, the idea of lifting the lockdowns in order to maximize and improve the health of children and other less vulnerable people who were being harmed by them. So we wrote this document, and we showed it around to folks, and I have to say I was very surprised by how positive the reaction was internally. there was a Lou Eastman, I think, at AIER, put the document on a web page, allowed people to sign on, and it just exploded. Like a huge number of scientists and epidemiologists and just started signing on, tens of thousands in just a few short days, 10,000, I think. Now it's like 40, 50, 60,000. I lost count.
Yeah, it's at like 960,000, I believe.
Those are for like regular people who sign up. I know some, there were many of those regular people are like quite prominent in their own fields, physicists, whatnot. And so it was extraordinary to me that there was this deep interest. I mean, I guess I knew that people were unhappy with the lockdown, but what I didn't understand really at the time was that they were looking for some articulation by reasonable people that those views were not fringe. That in fact they were a important mainstream view within infectious disease epidemiology, which I knew for a fact. I have to confess, Kate, at the time I actually thought that we were a minority view. In retrospect, after what's happened, I'm not sure that's true. I think that in fact the Great Barrington Declaration, the ideas in it were always something close to the majority view. And in fact, what has happened over the last 2.5 years is that a minority view has taken over the controls of pandemic policy, pandemic planning, used tools of censorship, fear, smearing in order to get their way, and create an illusion that they were in fact the center when they were in fact always have been the fringe.
Yeah, well, you know what? That actually makes a lot of sense because this was the way that people did things for so long before. So it was actually the lockdowns that were strange, the NPIs, as they called them, all of these restrictions and things that were strange and that were kind of fringe. Like the Great Barrington Declaration was not about putting stickers on the floor or putting up plexiglass shields and all of these, very bizarre things that we've never done before, right? So it does make sense in a way. And it sounds like this is kind of like a technocratic approach, right? Where you have these experts at the helm, the heads of these organizations, the FDA, the NIH, the CDC, the World Health Organization, they're all at the top and they're directing everything downwards, and if we look at Hayek, for example, in The Use of Knowledge in Society, he talks about local knowledge and he talks about how everything works best when it's more decentralized and you have, let's say, local hospitals working with the best kind of measures that they could use in their particular situation, that local people would understand best how to mitigate things. But the complete opposite happened, right? So
yeah, I mean, I think both parts of that are really right, Kate. So on the one hand, you had the center. You had Francis Collins, the head of the National Institute of Health, 4 days after we wrote the Great Barrington Declaration, writing the email that you referred to, in fact, obliquely, that we were fringe epidemiologists, three of us, me, Martin Kulldorff of Harvard University, and Sunetra Gupta of Oxford University, Stanford, Harvard, Oxford, that we were fringe epidemiologists. And then calling for a devastating takedown of the premises. And what happened next was essentially a smear campaign. Reporters started calling me, asking me why I want to let the virus rip. Essentially, why did I want to kill grandma? The center reacted really, really negatively to it, as if it were an existential threat. If they're right, we're fringe. Why even bother? They were, I think, embarrassed to that. Somebody had spoken up and said, look, this was a great mistake that we'd made during the lockdown to impose this society-wide lockdown. And on the other side of this, you speak of local knowledge. That's exactly what the Great Barrington Declaration was calling for. How do you do focus protection? We know from the epidemiology that there's a 1,000-fold difference in the risk of severe outcomes from this infection if you're older versus if you're younger. It's a real threat, this disease, if you're older, at least before in October 2020, it certainly was. Whereas if you are younger, it's much less of a threat. In fact, for children, there are many, many threats in their lives that are much worse caused by the lockdown than the disease itself.
Yes.
But the details of how do you accomplish focus protection, those details are highly dependent on local knowledge. Right. So it's going to be very different in downtown LA where and in Los Angeles, where there's many working class people living in smaller homes in multi-generational communities. Versus in Billings, Montana, where there's a lot more, a lot less of those multi-ethnic homes and seniors living alone, or places like nursing homes. It'll depend on the physical infrastructure of the places where people are living. It's going to require deep local knowledge, far beyond what I have. And the idea of the Great Barrington Declaration wasn't to put out a complete plan in every detail, in every community, in every place. The idea of the Great Barrington Declaration was to engage local public health in a conversation. It was a call to creativity, to ask, how do you protect older people in your communities? How do you protect vulnerable people in your community? How do you protect people who have certain chronic conditions that make them at higher risk? How do you maybe restructure the nature of work so that younger people who are lower risk can continue to do work, and then find ways to accommodate older, higher risk people when disease is spreading rapidly, for instance. Deploy resources, whatever they are, therapeutic resources, preventative resources, whatever they are, in places where they'll make the most difference. The principle was one of, in effect, was freedom, right? The idea wasn't to force people into confine older people into quarantine camps or some such nonsense. The idea was to provide tools, resources, and knowledge so that they could protect themselves and others with those resources, rather than trying to impose a lockdown, which devastated the poor, the vulnerable, children, and the working class.
Yeah, I'm actually really glad that you clarified that, because that's one critique that I had in my mind about focused protection, because I wasn't sure exactly what that meant in practice. And if you think about it in terms of, the benevolent technocrat, who does the other thing, who says, no, I have a better plan than you do. And that's not what the Great Barrington Declaration was. It was really like, here are some ways that you can organize. Here are some suggestions at how you can organize your local municipal levels and figure out what's the best strategy. Because I would argue that people inherently know what to do, like individuals know what to do. If we look back in 2018, 2019, 1990, if you were sick and you showed symptoms of being sick, you weren't going to go visit your grandmother, right? Like, this was just common sense. And that's how people tended to function. But now we've kind of thrown all the common sense out the window, and people are using plexiglass, and stickers on the floor and other things that they think protect them. And so I think you wrote about this as well. So then they end up getting closer to people who are vulnerable by using kind of these magical tools of protection that aren't actually efficient. And then you have, washing hands and things that are known to work, and staying away from people when you're sick, which people are not doing anymore. They'll just put on a mask, they'll go out, they say, I have COVID, but I'll still go and see my grandmother, kind of thing.
I mean, the key thing is that the attention budgets of people are finite. If you give me a list of 1,000 things that I need to focus on every single day in order to stay healthy, I'm not going to focus on 1,000 things. I don't have the attention span. No one really does. And my entire life will be focused on those 1,000 things and not on any of the other 10 million things that are important for me in order to thrive as a human being. And so in public health, you basically have to focus attention on the highest yield things in settings where it matters to people. Right. So when you do pandemic theater, when you push people to do things that are really low yield, and yet they have to tick it off, one more thing to tick off the box, you're going to essentially divert attention from the high yield things. And that's what we did. We absolutely did that. We focused attention on masking toddlers, making sure 2-year-olds were masked up for some reason, which there's no evidence that does anything for anybody. It probably harms the kids.
Yes.
We focused attention on treating other people as biohazards. I mean, that's essentially the principle of lockdown, right? The basic ideology of the lockdown is that other people are biohazards. And that itself has had deep deleterious consequences in how we think about other human beings. It's led to social, it's destroyed social cohesion. In ways that public health really should never do. Public health has a deep responsibility for the power that it has. Health is something that's deeply important to people, and we're sort of built to fear for threats to our health.
Yes.
The goal of public health, and especially other people, right? The fear of infectious disease is a primal thing. Civilization tempers that fear, reduces the perceived harm from interacting with other people, because in fact, interacting with other people is a source of great positive outcomes. It's how we thrive as humans. We're not actually made to be alone, even though we may fear others. And when public health accelerates our fear of others, encourages us to think of each other as biohazards, it's done a great disservice.
Have you heard of René Girard? Are you familiar with him and his work?
I am, yes.
Right. So the scapegoating mechanism, right? And he talks about during times of plague, historically, that's when you see people turn on each other. They'll turn on a group. All of their fears mount, and they want to relieve their tensions, and their competition with each other over scarcity, basically. And then they'll say, "Oh, we have to, attack this group." And that's what ended up happening as well. In the last 2.5 years, there was just the social cohesion just fell apart, and people started getting really angry at each other and targeting certain groups or certain individuals. And that happened to be the dissenters, right? The people who perhaps were more rational actors, or, who wanted to go back to a time of normalcy, they ended up being attacked. And that includes you and Martin and Sinetra, everybody who wrote the Great Barrington Declaration, and people who ascribe to those ideals. So what was that like for you during that time professionally?
I guess I read Girard when I was much younger. The idea is mimetic. We copy each other in our desire for things, but the things we want, we can't all have. So the desire here was perfect safety from this virus.
Yes.
Mimetic desire, and we then adopt all of the things that because this desire is irrational. There's no possible way to be truly safe from a virus that's highly infectious the way that COVID is, and so therefore we all face this common risk. We essentially treat each other as biohazards in a bid to stay away from the virus, right? And so when someone speaks up, says, "Look, these things that you're doing are incredibly destructive. It won't keep you safe from the virus." The scapegoating mechanism is exactly what happened here. Instead of trying to look at this proposal we put forward in a rational, reasoned way, in fact, what we were calling for was a conversation. We didn't put out a 5,000-page plan. We put out a one-page argument for a change in principles of how to manage the pandemic. Obviously a call for conversation. Instead of actually entering that conversation, the center treated us as if we were enemies. That there was something that just by the very fact that we were speaking, we were putting the entire community at threat. I started getting accusations of wanting to let the virus rip. I saw Tony Fauci make that accusation. Public health, the top of public health, used the scapegoating mechanism in order to expel the heretic, us, relegate us to the fringe. It was not a rational action. It was an action of a group of people that I think understood that what they had done during the early lockdown was really a violation of norms, and they were scared. Now they're still scared that people will come to think that they made an enormous mistake. I have to say, I don't think the solution to this kind of scapegoating mechanism is also scapegoating. I have no interest in that. I think the solution to this is actually forgiveness. Forgiveness, though, that involves a understanding, a thorough and truthful acknowledgement of error. And
Yes.
so the kind of thing I think ought to happen next is not finger pointing at mistakes by individual people and mistakes made. Although if someone committed a criminal act, that's another thing. But I do think that we have to have in medicine. There's an idea that there's a sort of procedure when a patient dies. What happens is the doctors that were involved in managing the patient, the nurses are involved in managing the patient, will get together in a conference called a Morbidity and Mortality Conference, an M&M conference. And during that conference, there's a frank discussion about what went wrong, what led to that patient's death. The goal isn't to say, look, this Dr. A did something really, really bad. We should expel the heretic. The goal is to say, these were the things that were mistakes. Let's not make them again. We have to have that kind of conversation. We owe the world that. Even if it is the case that some very, very prominent and previously beloved public figures made those mistakes, we owe the public that conversation. Yeah, and I don't think the goal should be to, it makes me honestly uncomfortable when people talk about Nuremberg trials and things like that. I don't think that's constructive. What ends up happening there is it just brings people into a defensive state when what really needs to be happening again is a conversation about what went wrong so we don't do it again.
Yeah. I think that what happens though, right, is when people do get scapegoated, they get angry as well, and they go on the defensive and, they want to see justice. And some people cross that line into revenge. So, there's a lot of bad feelings on either side in a sense. So it's understandable to me. It's not necessarily something that I would call for, but I do think that there definitely needs to be justice, and it's important to point out the difference between those two things. And it looks like this might be something that you're seeking now in your lawsuit that you have. And Anthony Fauci is named in that lawsuit, and the federal government, I believe. Do you want to get a little bit into the details of that and what's going on there?
Sure. So I think the tools that were used to suppress the ideas of the Great Barrington Declaration, actually, many ideas that oppose public health sort of orthodoxy during the pandemic. The tools that were used were entirely inconsistent with how liberal democracy ought to function. In particular, the U.S. federal government directed social media to help social media. These ideas are verboten. These ideas are outside the norm. These people, in many cases, are too fringe to even allow on your platforms. Essentially, the federal government directed a propaganda campaign, and I have to say that social media cooperated with it. I mean, it's not as if they were unwilling. But I believe that in a liberal democracy, government has an obligation to allow debate to happen openly. When you're talking about public health, the Great Barrington Declaration was not such a dangerous idea that it should be essentially excised from the public square with tools that usually you would leave only for either authoritarian governments use routinely, or you keep out because they're going to lead to directly the threat of like an individual life or something, right? So like if you might leave out
actual physical harm. Yes.
Yeah. What you have instead is a debate over principles that wasn't allowed to happen because it contradicted public health orthodoxy. That is so far outside the bounds of what liberal democracy ought to be doing that it really does call for some sort of acknowledgement and then correction. And so the lawsuit, first initially filed by the Attorney General's offices of Louisiana and Missouri, this lawsuit seeks to find what was the nature of the censorship regime that the U.S. federal government actually imposed. And we've actually made a lot of progress. We've uncovered documents from the discovery in this lawsuit of a dozen a federal agency cooperating very closely with social media and big tech, essentially saying, here are the ideas you should censor from your public conversation. And that includes, I think, Tony Fauci, where he shared phone numbers with Mark Zuckerberg, the CEO of Facebook. So you have this incredible, probably the most, if certainly peacetime, the most intrusive policy by the federal government in terms of First Amendment violations in American history. Maybe, I don't know. I'm sure maybe the Alien Insurrection Acts are. I don't know. I don't know history well enough to say that with certainty, but certainly
But
in my
let's say
lifetime.
at least one of them. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. And just brazenly done, almost out in the open, as if they were proud of it. If the courts don't acknowledge that as a First Amendment violation, then to me, it's unclear what the Bill of Rights in the United States actually means. It's just a piece of paper. We have to have the ability to talk with each other without big media and government putting its thumb on that conversation in science and in public health. And we've not had that during the pandemic.
Yeah. And, you see this all over, any opinion that any regular person posts on Facebook or on Twitter or anything else as well. It's just becoming this culture of silence and quashing dissent and censorship of anything that pretty much goes against the regime, or goes against the ideas of this kind of, woke ideology. We're seeing the same thing now with climate change. I did a video a couple of weeks ago for AIER on the energy crisis in Europe, right? And everything in there was presented as fact, and there was a warning, climate change, refer to the UN to find out about climate change. And you're not even allowed to debate these things anymore. You're not allowed to speak about them. And it's very dangerous because COVID seemed to be the Trojan horse to normalize that kind of behavior. And now we're seeing that moving forward, this has indeed become the new normal. That is really the lingering side effect. That's like the long COVID, essentially, is this kind of censorship that is pervasive.
Yeah, I mean, Martin Kulldorff in 2020 wrote a tweet, which I'm never going to forget. He said the Enlightenment, in fact, the Enlightenment has ended. If you think back to the key principle of the Enlightenment, what it was responding to was that there was the idea that there's a central authority that can distinguish true from false, that can ex cathedra on high say these ideas are true, these ideas are false, and if you disagree, then you're a heretic. You're to be censored and socially put down, excommunicated even. That is a dangerous idea. Essentially, it's the return to a dark age.
Yeah.
And essentially, that's what we've adopted. Except now, instead of Catholic priests or the Pope being the one in charge of deciding what is true or false, we have instead a different orthodoxy, a different sort of clerisy that decides. Public health officials. Tony Fauci, he said to Rand Paul, he said that if you criticize me, you're not simply criticizing a man, you are criticizing science itself. When you think about the hubris of that, even a group of people to say that would be, you'd look at them and think that they were crazy, I think.
Yeah.
The kind of hubris that would lead somebody to say that somehow they're infallible. I think that tells you a lot about them, and it doesn't tell you something good. I mean, what you want is a conversation to occur. Allow that to happen, even if someone is wrong. I think it was John Stuart Mill that made this argument that if I'm wrong and I'm in conversation with you, Kate, and you correct me, well, I've done you a favor by allowing you the opportunity to sharpen your arguments, so that you can then correct error. And you've done me a favor because you've corrected me from my error. The fact that some people might speak up and be wrong is not a bad thing for science. It's actually quite a good thing for science. Preventing people from speaking, that's a bad thing for science. And of course, I think it turns out that we were right, Kate, about the Great Barrington Declaration. I think the disease has spread despite the lockdowns. The lockdown harms have been absolutely devastating. And we did not engage in focused protection of the vulnerable. The very large fraction of people who died are above the age of 65. Like every
Yes.
single aspect of the thing that we warned about has come about. And it's I think if I look back, I regret that we didn't win the debate at the time. But I think the reason we didn't win the debate at the time is because illegitimate means were used to try to suppress the idea from spreading and from that debate from happening. And I think science needs to look back on how it dealt with these kinds of ideas and reform, or else we really are in a dark age.
Well, that was very well said. And, if you think about Carl Jung, he spoke about post-World War II, what happens to man when they lose their religion. He was talking about that kind of, fall or autumn of the Enlightenment, in a sense. And so they tend to replace it. They tend to fill that void with deifying the state. And we could argue that the science, has become a kind of secular religion, but the state is kind of running it. And you have other things underneath the same umbrella, as I was saying, climate change, and then other ideologies that are more radical. They all seem to fall under the same umbrella of science, though. So there seems to be this religious element to it, as you're saying, where you're committing heresy if you say anything different, if you disagree. And I think that what's happened with people, if it's true that the majority does in fact agree with the premises of the Great Barrington Declaration and maybe even agreed at the time, what's happening with them is that they've become so afraid of the social whiplash, maybe even more than the boot stamping down from on top, is that their neighbor or their colleague or their family member or their friend are going to reject them, if they don't go along. You think about things like the Asch conformity experiment, right? Where you have these lines that are different lengths and you ask each individual, well, is this the same length as this line? Well, no, it's not. But the other guy said, and the 5 people before you said that they're all the same length. And then the guy starts to think, well, maybe I'm seeing this wrong. Maybe they are the same length. Maybe I have a problem. Maybe my eyesight is off. Maybe my brain chemistry is off. I don't know what's going on. Or maybe I should just say that they're the same length because that's what they want me to say.
I mean, this is Girardian limitless, right? Look, I think you can find there's no end of foibles of the human brain and of people. I think that's just normal, part of being human. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. But we create social systems, and science is one great social system to sort of reduce the harm from the worst parts of those, right? So we learn true things by being in conversation with one another, and you correcting me, or the vast number of wise people before me I read about, and they correct me also. You have to these systems are there in order to benefit us, like these systems of conversation, of science. When they're disrupted, when they're sort of hijacked in a way so that a small group of people get to decide for a very large number of others, bad things happen. I say another thing about science. I think it's important. It's not just that free conversation stopped happening inside science during the pandemic, which absolutely did. Again, I think it was hijacked. Essentially, people like Tony Fauci and Francis Collins used their power of funding and also of essentially creating social hierarchies in biomedicine to impose their ideas over and above others. The other thing I think is that science. I mean, I love science. I devoted my life to scientific, to working in science. But it is not the sum of all human knowledge and wisdom. It has its place. So when you are asking whether, whether this virus is going to cause a lot of harm, mortality risk, you ask scientists to measure that mortality risk. But scientists do not have a monopoly on wisdom. Are not able to say, well, if I have to invest in, in things, what principle should I use to invest in? Like, I think the principle should be protection of the vulnerable. That's a major value for me. But if I'm honest, Kate, that comes outside of science. It comes from other experiences and other systems in my life.
Mm-hmm.
It's defensible. I believe it's reasonable. I believe it's rational, but it's not scientific. If you ask me to justify why I care about vulnerable people, I'm going to talk about my faith. I'm going to talk about what I'm called to. I'm not going to talk about science says you must defend the vulnerable, because it doesn't. Science in that sense is amoral. And so you have to have non-scientists, when you're designing policies that impact so many people, at the table with a fundamental role in the design of those policies. You can't just say, oh, you're a scientist, tell us what to do. That doesn't work that way. You can ask a scientist, if I do A, what will happen? Will B happen? Will C happen? And the scientist will give you, if they're good scientists and it's possible, they'll tell you the answer. Oh, well, B is likely to happen, C may happen, but it's unlikely. And then I have to decide, do I want to do action A or not? Right? Those will involve values outside of science.
Yeah. And that actually explains as well the moral differences between people who wanted to have lockdowns at all costs, despite the fact that it was obvious that this was going to be putting people into poverty, putting people into starvation, that this would be killing people, deaths of despairs. Things like this, that this would be immensely harmful to children, that this would be stressful for families, people who would lose their jobs. And it also separated people, into essential and non-essential categories, which is actually very Marxist sounding to me. Like it's creating a new kind of class, right? And you often talk about the laptop class, which are people who are, like yourself in a sense, right? You're in academia, you're able to continue to work. Maybe even for some people, their work circumstances improved. They were able to now work from home. They were able to afford, a home gym or things like that. They could set up different things. They could renovate their house. They could renovate their home office. And maybe this was actually a kind of staycation for some people, that period. And so it was very beneficial. But then the burden of disease was, of course, placed upon people who were deemed essential, who couldn't work from home. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? The harms of lockdowns. There's so many, but.
Yeah, I think that you hit it on the head, Kate. The key thing is that the lockdowns are deeply unequal, and they're unequal for simple reasons. Society itself is deeply unequal, right? You have people who have jobs. I think that the estimate in the United States is something like 20-30% of jobs that could be replaced by work from home, that could be replaced by Zoom. One of the reasons I think that we've never had a lockdown before is we didn't have this kind of technology we're using to interface with each other in such an efficient way. I mean, we had Skype before, but we didn't have Zoom. Zoom is a big advance, actually.
Yeah.
That capacity to work from home, it didn't pertain to everyone. Something maybe 20-30% of the American population. The reason why we didn't have lockdowns in 2009 during the swine flu epidemic is because we didn't have Zoom. Zoom created a lockdown. In some sense.
Yeah.
And so if you work this through, lockdown benefited only a relatively small group of people, in the rich West, and the people who could afford to work from home. But someone had to support that lifestyle, keep the electrical lines going, sewage working, water going. Someone had to deliver groceries. Someone had to grow food. So a whole class of people that keep society going quietly, and we don't even think about it. We in the lockdown class don't even think about it often. They paid the price. COVID spread in those groups even if they were older, they were exposed to COVID because they had to work for their families. In the poorer parts of the world, this was absolutely devastating, right? So we had, you heard supply chain disruptions. Over the last 40 years, the world has become more deeply interconnected as far as trade goes. Since the and what's happened is poorer economies have reorganized their economies, their workplaces, and so on, in order to fit in with the global economy. And 1 billion people have been lifted out of poverty over the last 20 years, or last 40 years. 1 billion people. As it's a result, partly of that globalization. Well, what happened then? What happened during the lockdown is essentially that lifting of people out of poverty. That comes because of a promise we made to stay connected to each other. Lockdown broke that promise, and millions and millions and millions, tens of millions of people, of the very poorest people on earth, earning $1 or $2 a day or less of income, essentially were thrown into distress. The UN was estimating early on in the pandemic, in April of 2020, that 130 million additional people would starve as a consequence of the economic dislocation caused by the lockdown. And while it hasn't resulted in 130 million, I do think it's resulted in extensive starvation, tens and tens of millions of people. In March of 2021, there was another UN estimate that 240,000 children had died in South Asia alone as a consequence of the economic dislocation caused by the lockdown. In Africa, there are stories I've heard of people calling suicide hotlines saying, "I can't feed my kids. I'm considering committing suicide and killing my kids because I don't want to watch them starve." The cruelty of the lockdowns on the poor of the world is almost impossible to overstate. And we did this knowing it's not as if we didn't have warnings. The psychological effect on children has been devastating. Like, you have anxiety and depression levels that are through the roof basically everywhere, poor countries and rich countries alike. And especially for children who need socialization, who need playtime, who need contact with other people in order to develop well. We denied them that. In the Philippines, for 2 years, children were not allowed to go outside the house. So you have a situation where the lockdown violated the social compact I think we have, where we, at the very least, try not to harm the poor. Lockdowns were probably the single worst catastrophe that happened to the poor, at least in peacetime, in my lifetime.
This is all very devastating. And this will go on and on and on, and we'll continue to discover more information like this and different niches, because the world is so complex and there are so many different niches that have been affected in particular ways. I recall speaking with a friend of mine who lives in a small island in the Malaysias, and was saying how, because the tourism sector was uprooted overnight, everything just stopped. People lost their businesses, of course, but a large part of their economy was based on tourism. And so what he was explaining was that all of the children, began being trafficked, and their families were selling them, essentially as sex slaves. And this is how they were dealing with this, and this is how they were going to put food on their table and unburden themselves of their children. And so, it's devastating, and we see it in the less developed parts of the world, and we see it in the Western world as well. There were reports of, in Canada, children, I think they're suicidal thoughts in children, not even adolescents, in children became a thing for the first time. En masse. There was like 25 or 30% of children who were reporting this, and they were ending up in hospital. And, it's just devastating that we've done this to children, and that all along, the people at the helm of the response to COVID couldn't have been unaware of this. this information is out there, so unless you just don't want to look, or unless you just don't care, it's very easy for people like Tony Fauci to then play the victim and say, oh, people are attacking me about the lockdowns and I'm just doing my job. I'm just saving lives, Well, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. So even if you think that you're doing the best thing, again, this comes back to Hayek. If you have, even the most benevolent dictator, you're still going to have harm done. So no matter what you think that you're doing, if you think that it's the best thing for everybody, you can't possibly know the consequences, the domino effect of this on the local level and on the individual level, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is what you're talking about is a law of unintended consequences. I mean, the lockdowns were bound to have, if you want to call them unintended consequences, those exactly that. You mentioned children. I mean, in the United States, young adults, 1 in 4, according to the CDC survey in June of 2020, 1 in 4 young adults had seriously considered suicide the previous month. 1 in 4. The level of psychological, there was child abuse at very high levels, not picked up because schools were closed. The schools are where people normally pick up child abuse so that you can then address it. In Uganda, they closed schools and 4.5 million children never came back from school, never came back to school after the schools opened. They were just gone, lost. You're absolutely right about sexual slavery. A lot of children in the poor countries, in order to feed their families, their families sold their children, especially girls, into sexual slavery. These are obviously not nothing anybody really wants to happen, but they were, and they may have been unintended, but a lot of this was predictable. Domestic violence rose during lockdown. They were entirely predictable and should have been accounted for when we were just thinking about whether to adopt this extraordinary policy we followed the last 2.5 years. It's still not done. I mean, a lot of people are still scared. They still act as if they're scared and have disrupted their lives around this. You can see this in the fact that many jobs, many high-end laptop class jobs in the United States, people still have not come back to work. And so I think the damage done is so great. We will absolutely be counting it for a very long time. I think more important to me than just counting the damage, how do we mitigate it? Like, it's not certain, like a 5-year-old who should have learned how to read, a kid who's now 7 that should have learned to read when he was 5, but still doesn't know how to read in second grade or something. Well, that's not permanent. That's fixable if we put our mind to it. We know that there's a harm. Let's try to redress the harm. Not all of the harm is fixable, but some of it is. And I think constructively, that's what we ought to be doing. Thinking of ways to address the harms that have been caused by the lockdown, the psychological harms, the economic harms, the educational harms. And so that the long tail of lockdown harms that is going to come will be less damaging than otherwise would be.
Yeah, that's a very, very good point. We seldom think of that because you're focused on the horror. Like, it's so terrible what has happened, and coming to terms with that. It's something that, people like you and I who have been aware of that for pretty much since the beginning, and probably many of our viewers as well. But there are other people who are just kind of waking up to that now, and maybe are in denial as well about the fact that this happened to them and that it happened to their kids, and that they were in fact victim as well to this whole system. So I want to come back to something very, very basic though, and that is the precautionary principle. Right. So this is something that, of course, MDs learn about, citizens, regular laymen hear about this thing. They might not know exactly what it means, and it seems to be something that can be kind of interpreted in different ways. So for you, how does this apply to lockdowns or these measures that we've seen?
Well, I mean, I think the precautionary principle actually, it's applied correctly is actually quite sensible. It's not that you throw out our usual way of thinking about, cost and benefit. You do a pros list and a cons list, remember, and then you can figure out what you want to do based on that. You still do that, The question is, what do you do when there's deep uncertainty about certain outcomes, right? So what do you do when there's a new virus? You don't know how deadly it is. You don't know how truly infectious it is. You have some data, but it's incomplete. And you're deciding what to do about it. The precautionary principle says, to me, anyways, I think that you're entitled to assume the worst, again, within bounds of reason about the threat. And you're allowed to say, okay, this threat is going to be really, really bad. I don't know for certain it's going to be really bad, but what if it's really bad, right? And then design a strategy around it. But what the precautionary principle does not allow you to do is to assume that the threat, that the intervention that you're putting in place is going to be costless. That way, it will work with certainty. Mm-hmm. You have to, especially when there's not uncertainty about that. You put in place lockdowns. You are going to cause tremendous damage to the poor of the world. It is going to be very difficult for most of the world's population to comply because it's such a cruel policy that only a relatively small group of elite people, the laptop class, that can abide. That's a certainty. There's no uncertainty around that. The precautionary principle doesn't allow you to say, oh, no, there's not going to be cost to the poor.
Yeah.
So the precautionary principle is limited in the sense that it allows you to assume something about a threat that's coming, assume the worst about a threat that's coming where there's deep uncertainty about it. But then you still have to do your list of pros and cons and decide whether it's the right thing. I think the precautionary principle properly applied would have cut against lockdowns rather than in favor of it.
Yeah.
Had it been applied properly. And then as new evidence comes, you have to reassess as the uncertainty about what the nature of that threat from the virus is. You have to reassess. You can't just continually rely on the precautionary principle, assuming the worst when new evidence comes in saying, well, it's not the worst. It's bad for older people, less bad for children. Well, then you have to take that into account and then change the policy on the basis of that new evidence. Precautionary principle is not a get out of jail free card for lockdowns.
Well, that's I guess you're describing in a way, I think, the scientific process as I learned it when I was in school, which was you go there, you do your experiment, you test your hypothesis, you want to disprove it even. You want to show that it doesn't work. You want to be absolutely sure that it does, or do you have to change this variable or that variable? Back to the drawing board. That's how it goes. There's never just, I am the science. This is the science, and we're done. There's no conjecture, no criticism. Here we go. I mean, but that's what we've seen happen. And I think that this is why, science, capital S, has become this religion, whereas actual science is a process, right? It's a process.
Yeah, I mean, there's this policy overlay, right? So again, you have this scientific input with a lot of uncertainty around it in February 2020 or something. And a policymaker has to decide, okay, I have this input. What am I going to do with it? And the precautionary principle is a way of dealing with that policy, that scientific uncertainty in the policy process. So I'm allowed to assume the worst. But then the thing I'm going to do is going to be based on, yes, the worst that I've assumed about the virus, but also the fact that all of these policies are themselves going to have knock-on consequences. I can't just ignore those knock-on consequences when I'm deciding what to do, even if the worst about the virus is going to happen. And then you're absolutely right, Kate, as evidence comes in and you learn about the virus, all this uncertainty sort of starts to resolve and, okay, it's over here. Well, then you change the policy. It's not this, you're going to do that, right? So you have to, it's policy and science interact in very interesting ways. Precautionary principle is a tool for helping manage that uncertainty about science. But it's not an excuse not to work on the science, to reduce that uncertainty. And it's not an excuse to maintain a policy that's extremely harmful, just because you assume that it was going to be okay or justified based on some previous calculation.
Yeah, it's kind of like the worst excuse in the world too. Like if you've wronged somebody, which is what has happened on on the large scale. People have been wronged. And rather than saying, I apologize, I made a mistake, let's see how we can fix this, let's see how we can change course, it becomes, but I didn't mean to hurt you, so I'm not really going to apologize. I'll give a faux apology, let's say. But there's not even any faux apologies. There's not even any acknowledgement that there was a problem. Like, it's just like, now, we've moved on to the next thing. And, with the news cycle. And I would argue even that the whole response to COVID couldn't have existed without the propaganda, as you were explaining it, because you wrote about how in 2019, I saw this on your Twitter recently, how in 2019 the blood banks in Europe had shown that there was already between September and November existing COVID in the blood banks, right? And so, society hadn't been locked down. Nobody was aware of it. There wasn't, I don't think, any excess mortality either. There were people getting sick in 2019. I actually personally recall getting quite sick. I had this kind of strange bug that lasted like 24 hours, and then I'm young, I'm healthy, I was okay, but it was a little different than something else. And but maybe this was already there, and maybe if we wouldn't have even known about it, if there would have been no media attention to this at all, then we would have been living in a completely different world today.
Yeah, I mean, so the what you're talking about, I think, is that in blood banks, they often store blood with dates. So blood collected in northern Italy has from September 2019, as early as September 2019, September, October, and November of 2019, has antibodies to COVID. How did they get there? I mean, that means COVID was there had seeded in northern Italy. And that's not surprising. Northern Italy had a very early, explosion of cases, right? Earlier than the United States, for instance. If you look in stored blood in Angola, from blood banks in Angola, northern Africa, you see the same thing. Again, from September 2019, positive antibodies to COVID. What's happened is it's likely that there was a relatively early seeding event, as early as September 2019. Maybe, I don't know the exact date. I don't think anybody knows the exact date. And you're right, Kate. Now, part of that is there is this sort of like early phase, almost exponential, like very, very sharp growth in the thing. But you have very small numbers. Even exponential growth doesn't look noticeable in the population. And so some people probably got it and didn't know they had it. It had COVID, chalked it up to a bug, and who knows? And maybe what you had was COVID, maybe it wasn't. It's impossible to go back and tell in time. But what seems clear is that there was an early seeding event, based on this kind of antibody evidence. And there wasn't, this panic. Imagine a world, if we had not panicked in September 2019, imagine a world where we had adopted something like the Great Barrington Declaration, where public health had worked to calm the population and then focused resources on protecting the vulnerable. I believe that we would have had better results both from COVID and from, of course, we would have avoided the collateral harms from the lockdown.
Yeah, that makes so much sense to me. I do worry, though, that at the same time, the panic might have been inevitable. Maybe not, though. Maybe, if the media hadn't given it the type of hype that they did, maybe it would have been avoidable, and it would have just been kind of like SARS or H1N1, where some people got a little scared, but most people were like, this is not affecting me. I'm okay, But that worries me a little bit for focused protection, even in the Great Barrington Declaration, that might be taken into the hands of people, even at the local level, and they might go a little bonkers with it, and we've seen that happen with the long-term care facilities for the elderly. There are reports of some long-term care homes where they took the doorknobs off of the doors and locked people in their rooms in Ontario. And I'm sure this happened in other jurisdictions as well. And we've seen as well that many of the COVID deaths, it's possible that they're attributed to the treatments that these patients underwent. And I can give you a very personal example, but something like this happened to my grandfather, who is in a long-term care home in Quebec. And, he was there. Somebody tested positive for COVID. I think somebody who worked there. So they tested everybody. And then my grandfather tested positive, right? But he had no symptoms. So it was like, okay, he's all right. And then 24 hours later, he was dead. And he had been given morphine, he had been given midolazam, or I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly, but he had been given these drugs that were part of the protocol. And now listen, I know that this was not focused protection. So I just want to differentiate that, make that clear for our audience as well. But what I'm trying to say here is that things went horribly wrong because of the panic, because of the protocols that were put in place. And it's hard, I think, to tell if we had left things well enough alone, which is pretty much what the Great Barrington Declaration is about as well, and that's how I interpret it anyways. I don't want to put that put words into your mouth there, but I read that as something that's rational and something that's common sense and something that follows regular protocols since we've been doing for 100 years. But maybe if we would have left things well enough alone and gone about treating things normally, then we wouldn't have had as many deaths, because it's coming out in reports, right, that many deaths can be attributed to the treatments themselves.
I think so. There's a couple of things in there that are really interesting and important, I think, Kate. So one is, why did we induce panic? Like, what was the purpose of public health working to create panic? And we know they did. Like, so for instance, in the UK, there was a group called the SAGE group, so SAGE, which is a scientific advisory group for the government, the official scientific advisory group for the government. They had a subunit called the Nudge subunit, whose goal was to cause panic, like that used behavioral psychological techniques to cause panic in the population. You can see it in the advertisements the public health did, where essentially they would use young people dying from COVID to warn young people to comply. The purpose of the panic was to gain compliance by low risk people who are not going to be harmed from COVID, to create this idea that COVID was a threat to you, a young person. And as well, like the empathy was weaponized to gain compliance of young people. If you don't obey the lockdown, you're going to kill your own grandma. Horrible. If you don't wear a mask, you're going to kill everyone around you. You are a biohazard. You're a danger to others. All these tools, these psychological tools, were used to gain compliance for the lockdown. If you don't if you don't have the lockdown, you don't need to use these tools to gain compliance with it. These were a piece of a tapestry, like one piece were needed for the other.
Yes.
So I think if you don't do a lockdown, you don't need to create the panic. The second part has to do with focused protection. I guess, Kate, I don't think about this as we would have gone along just as we normally do. This is a bad virus, and it does deserve a real response, a serious response in older people. That said, I do agree that the kind of response it deserved needed to be measured based on the needs of older people, right? So, for instance, extended social isolation for a long period of time is very bad for the health of older people. Like, bad for everybody, but certainly for older people.
Yeah.
So balancing infection control spread versus the need for social interactions, friendships, love, that has to be part of how you manage this virus. It has to be part of focused protection. It won't be exactly like, pre-2020 life. It just can't be when you're facing a high risk like this for older people. But it has to be humane, whatever it looks like. The panic, I have to say, for older people was a disaster. Like I read this story in Quebec that the caretakers in nursing homes in March 2020, abandoned their posts, leaving older people to die of starvation and hunger.
Yes.
the ones with dementia.
Yes.
The panic affected caregivers, infected doctors. Why did your father or your grandfather get sedatives? It's partly to manage the perceived risk that caregivers had that he posed to them.
Yes.
The excess use of intubation in the early days of the pandemic. In fact, the whole mantra to flatten the curve is to spare hospital systems because doctors were afraid of getting sick from their own patients
Mm-hmm.
in March of 2020. That was I mean, it's just to be honest, that was part of the impetus behind the lockdowns and the flatten the curve. Instead of the principle of focused protection of the vulnerable, identify the people who are most high risk and work to protect them, we instead adopted a policy to protect hospital systems. We just have to come to terms with that. Normally, you would think about hospitals and doctors and the medical care system serving the public, serving the vulnerable, serving the poor, as that's an ideal. Instead, public health flipped this around and said, look, the public needs to engage in deep sacrifices to protect hospitals, to protect hospital workers.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that it was not entirely. I mean, I do think that there's some obligations the public might have. If you say, look, be careful about that. There's a lot of of COVID going around. Be careful about visiting grandma. Deliver
Mm-hmm.
groceries so that older people don't have to go out. Employers, give your older employees a sabbatical when the disease is spread. I mean, there are obligations we could have like information and support that we could have given to society at large that would have involved some change in activities to mitigate risk where it was the highest. But that's very different than spreading panic to induce compliance by low risk people for a policy that was destined to fail and didn't end up protecting vulnerable people anyways.
Yeah. And I think information and support, those are key words, because this all has to be voluntary, of course, right? I mean, another anecdote, I had a friend of mine who her elderly father, he used to love and go and play bingo and go grocery shopping. Those were his two social activities. And he was in his 80s. And, at the very beginning, she said, you know what, Dad, if you go out, if you go play bingo, and if you go to the grocery store, you can't come over here and see me and your grandchildren. And that was devastating for him, right? Because he said, and I explained to my friend, and this was very early on, I said, maybe your father values more his social interactions than even his health. Maybe he would rather lead a shorter life. Maybe he'll say, I'll risk it. If I die, in 6 months, I catch COVID and I die, well, I wouldn't have died alone and I would have been able to live my life. It's the end of my life. It's supposed to be the golden age. Let me decide for myself what I want to do. And I don't know what ended up happening, in that particular scenario, but we've certainly seen that with a lot of elderly people, a very similar psychological response to young children, right? Where they took the isolation very badly and they were no longer able to cope. There were reports of people who said, if there's another lockdown, just give me euthanasia because I can't go through this again. Right. And I read this article. It was a lady who decided that she would have a medically assisted suicide because she didn't want to do another lockdown. She didn't want to be alone anymore, And so those are, of course, really important aspects to look at. And so I always argue that it's difficult, right, to draw the line, in public health between what is information without coercion, what is voluntary, what is suggested, and what is a policy that becomes an obligation for people to follow that might have those unintended consequences you were speaking to earlier.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard. I think. I don't. I guess I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say that I'm against all coercion as a principle in public health. But I will say is that if a public health that has the trust of the populace doesn't really need to use coercion very often to implement its policies. So like take the vaccines and vaccine uptake. In Sweden, you have very, very high vaccine uptake without mandates. Why? Because the public health authorities acted in trustworthy ways. And so when public health said, this group really needs the vaccines, that group really, the older people really need the vaccines to protect themselves against high mortality from COVID, they took the vaccines because they trusted public health. So in a sense, the fact that public health in the United States and elsewhere resorted to these kinds of coercive means, mandates and whatnot, is itself an indication of failure of public health.
Yeah.
And I think, so that's why I think, I'm not saying it in principle against it. I think, but as a general matter, coercion should be a tool of last resort in public health because it, by its very nature, undermines trust. And that means that other priorities in public health that require trust won't happen. And so that's why you have to be very careful about using these means. And we're seeing this, by the way, with the uptake of other vaccines, like childhood vaccines, like really necessary ones, like the MMR vaccine, measles vaccines, or the polio vaccine. We're seeing a resurgence of cases of measles in poor countries. I'm afraid they're going to have to start happening elsewhere in the United States and elsewhere as well. We see the return of polio to the United States. The priorities of public health require that the public trust public health for a very large number of things. And as soon as that you start using coercive means, and especially psychologically manipulative coercive means, the trust of the public is going to start to dissipate. And it absolutely has. I think the trust in public health is as low as I've ever seen it anywhere in my lifetime. And I honestly don't know how to get it back. I think that it may take a change in leadership in public health for that to happen.
Yeah, I think a change in leadership, but also a change in the paradigm, so let's not maybe use coercion the way that we've been doing it. Let's really support voluntary decision makings. Let's go back to informed consent. Let's go back to honoring the relationship between doctor and patient and that individual relationship, right? Because that's also, you were saying how Martin Kulldorff, he tweeted about the end of the Enlightenment, but a very important principle of the Enlightenment, of course, is the sacred nature of the relationship between doctor and patient, right? Like the Hippocratic Oath is based upon that. Is that not true?
Yeah. I mean, there has to be a deep commitment to truth-telling. The doctor-patient relationship, the doctor has to be essentially an agent for the patient, much less so an agent for the state, or for public health. The advice that when you go see a doctor, you should basically be able to trust that the doctor is giving you the advice in order to further your health. And if there's a conflict between your health and public health, the doctor, I think, has a responsibility to tell you, here's what would be good for your health, but it might harm others. And then I think, I think the absolute commitment to truth telling.
Yeah.
And I think, even when the truth contradicts what I want you to do, what I think it's better for me to tell you the truth, and then you do the thing I don't want you to do, than for me to lie to you. Now I have no hope of convincing you because you come back and say, well, why did you tell me a lie?
Yes.
And I think that that's what's happened in public health. Public health has embraced this norm of noble lies in order to manipulate the public to do what they view as virtuous.
Yes.
But I think that was a violation of a basic principle of not just the public health, but of public policy just generally. Like you cannot if you do that, you shouldn't be surprised when people stop trusting you, and then you get deep pushback on basically every single thing you ask people to do. You're just not going to be able to get the kind of voluntary cooperation that avoids the need for coercion. No one wants to be manipulated.
Yeah, of course. Nobody wants to be manipulated and nobody wants to be coerced. And, unfortunately, in the example that you're giving as well, it's difficult for even individual doctors because they're being put under duress by their colleges, by their organizations, by their medical associations, and then the organizations above them to say, well, you need to follow the orthodoxy once again. So you have to inform your patients what we tell you to inform them. But you basically have to repeat what we're telling you, but you're not allowed to question what we're telling you either. And that causes decay in the doctor-patient relationship as well because they don't feel free in their practice, right?
Yeah. I mean, there's a bill in California that was just signed by Governor Newsom called AB 2098. And ostensibly what the bill says is if a doctor spreads misinformation to a patient about COVID-19, then that doctor can lose his or her license over that act of misinformation spread. And that may
Yeah.
sound like a reasonable thing, but actually what it does is it puts public health in the examination room with you. And so the doctor now no longer serves the patient, but now the doctor serves public health over and above the patient. And if they don't serve public health, they might lose their license. Now, this would be fine if public health advice were inerrant. But in fact, during the pandemic, we've seen that public health has gotten a very large number of things wrong about immunity after COVID recovery, about whether the vaccine stopped disease spread, about the infection fatality rate, who is at high risk, how the disease spreads, the efficacy of inadequate masks, a very large number of items that were public health orthodoxy during the pandemic turned out to be false. And if a doctor who's read the evidence in the scientific literature concludes that public health is saying wrong things, and they tell their patient, look, I've read this literature and this is what I believe is true based on my professional understanding. Even though the powers that be are saying this, here's what the scientific evidence is actually saying. Well, that doctor then now is under threat of losing their license. So what will happen is doctors will censor themselves.
Yes.
The conversation that doctors would have with their patient, they'll violate the norms, the obligations they have to their patients. And they will also, a scientific conversation will also start to be censored and stifled even more than it has, because doctors play a really important role in giving feedback about how, I don't know, you write something, your scientific body says, oh, you ought to do this for a patient. The doctors then start doing that for the patient. They start seeing something that the scientific body didn't expect. That's what happened with thalidomide and babies, right? In the 50s. That's how science and medicine learns, but in part by feedback from real world evidence from doctors. That's going to be silenced. It actually is a shocking thing that you have a law that is almost guaranteed to end up harming patients, end up harming science, signed by the governor of a state of California. And I think like this, like it's just indicative of where we are. First Amendment protections would normally be enough to say, look, doctors have a First Amendment right too. Yeah. They're not trying to give misinformation to they're trying to give their own sense of what the literature says tailored to the patient. Why should their license be under threat when they do that in a setting where there's deep uncertainty and about the science? And the fact is that the scientific bodies, the public health bodies, have got things deeply wrong over and over again.
So COVID really, the response to COVID has been this Trojan horse to really normalize, again, these kinds of things, to normalize people censoring themselves and being afraid to say what they actually think, and being afraid to have debates, because as you said, this is how the process works. This is how you figure out that maybe you were wrong about this, but you were right about that, and maybe this person thinks 80% the same way that you do. So what are you alike on, but where do you differ, and how do you figure out the truth, right? If you're always looking for objective truth, as close as you can get to that, then there should be nothing that gets in your way. And that's essentially what this is doing, is it's deterring the light, and this is why, again, you can say this is the case for the end of the Enlightenment era, because that light that's there is being blocked by authorities who are saying you're not allowed to look there. You're not allowed to even talk about it, because if you do, we're going to come cracking down on you. And then you have this culture of people at all levels who will control themselves, who will rein it in, who will again say the line is the same size, because I'm afraid of the social pressure, but I'm also afraid of the boot now. So you have both going on simultaneously, right?
I mean, I think the closest analogy to this that I can think of in history is in the Soviet Union, there was a scientist named Trofim Lysenko who believed that if you exposed plants to sort of cold shock or whatever, the ones that survived would be like really strong and grow well. And then, so you keep planting those, you get offering of those, and you could very rapidly improve Soviet agriculture. Stalin loved it because all the other biologists were telling him about Mendelian genetics and how difficult it was and how long it was going to take to improve Soviet agriculture. Lysenko then had the power to send his colleagues to Siberia, and he did. The large numbers of scientists, Mendelian geneticists, were sent to Siberia, the Gulag. And actually, most then Soviet scientists, biologists silenced themselves. And millions of people starved in the Soviet Union because of the bad ideas Lysenko had that were not corrected by better ideas. It's a really dangerous. Now, we're not sending people to Siberia. What we are doing is we are taking away licenses, essentially excommunicating people. Saying that, look, you spent your life trying to learn how to manage patients, while you're not learning how to do that anymore. I mean, it's in effect a social Siberia that we're doing. If doctors don't march in line in lockstep.
We can call this even the digital gulag in some senses, right? Like I've heard this term before. So it's a way to create a gulag with the new technology that we have, and I don't mean to undermine the seriousness of going to an actual gulag in the USSR in that time. But we're able to create psychological torture and conditions to make people's life basically hell, to destroy their lives in other ways without having to subject them to the same types of treatments that we were then.
I mean, it's a social credit system designed. To essentially exile people who disagree, who are on the fringe.
Yes.
The problem is that a lot of truth comes out of allowing people on the fringe to participate in those conversations, to participate in society. There's a lot of harm, I think, in the long run from that. And if the argument I've heard, the counter argument I've heard is, well, okay, yeah, there's some bad misinformation that sometimes spreads. It's true, there is. The vaccines make you magnetic or something silly. Not true. But how do you counter that? You counter that by throwing people who say that into the gulag, or do you just say, look, this is not true. It doesn't make sense. In fact, there's this weird thing where, like, if you highlight nonsense, you actually spread it. Some of the craziest things, the earth is flat. You just don't talk about, because what's the purpose of talking about it?
Yes.
It just spreads the idea whereas you focus on true things. If you focus your attention on true things, you're going to end up with more people believing true things than if you focus your attention on stomping out heresy.
Yeah, of course, because then it's hard to tell what's what for people, right? And then they'll be attracted to everything that is being censored. And, not all of that. Some information that's being censored is good information, worth thinking about, and other information is total garbage. So it's really difficult for people to then filter through, because people are tribal on either side of the debate, and sometimes they'll say, well, I'll just believe everything coming from this side, and I'll just believe everything coming from this side, rather than thinking for themselves. Again, coming back to Rene Girard, there's the minority who gets scapegoated is not immune from tribal behavior and in scapegoating the other, right? So actually, I think that we could talk all day. This is, we've been going on for some time now. And this has been really wonderful, and I don't want it to end. So I'm gonna throw something at you, though, that I kind of prepared for the end of our discussion, and I think it's pretty on point. I was watching your recent interview with Peter Robinson of the Hoover Institution, which was wonderful. And at the end, of course, Peter asks you, like, how do we avoid this ever happening again, right? And I was thinking, that's not the question that I'm going to ask you. I'm going to ask you something different, and I'm just going to pull it up because I think it's pretty relevant. So instead, I wanted to read you this quote, okay? So rather than how do we prevent this from happening again, okay? Because right now, we're still in the thick of it. As you just mentioned with the California law that's coming into place. Like this battle is still ongoing. We're just in a different place than we were when you wrote the Great Barrington Declaration with the other two eminent doctors. So I'll quote this Hannah Arendt, Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil, where she says, "It is in the very nature of things human that every act that has once made its appearance and has been recorded in the history of mankind stays with mankind as a potentiality long after its actuality has become a thing of the past. No punishment has ever possessed enough power of deterrence to prevent the commission of crimes." So we can look at that in terms of lockdown. We could look at that in terms of Ursula von der Leyen, European Commissioner, Central Planner, saying now we need to flatten the curve on energy. We can look at that in the terms of people espousing beliefs about how we'll need climate lockdowns. What are your thoughts, Jay?
I mean, lockdown is now a part of our toolkit. That's just a fact. Given that that's a fact, we need to have an honest conversation about the conditions under which we will adopt it. I have a very ambitious goal, Kate, on this. I want to make lockdown a dirty word. I want people, when they think about lockdown, to shudder in horror because of the harms it'll do to the poor, the vulnerable, children, the working class. I want people to think about lockdowns in a way that makes them essentially never want to adopt it. That won't come about, I don't think, via legal action or even political action. That'll come about by people talking honestly about the experience of lockdowns during COVID, the futility of them. I mean, almost everybody's gotten COVID. Very large fraction of the population have gotten COVID, despite them. And we have all these harms. I think if we restore our ability to talk to each other freely as scientists, if we bring back the Enlightenment, lockdowns will be, I think Hannah Arendt can be proven wrong. I think they can be a thing of the past. But we have to allow that honest conversation to happen without suppression the way we've had during the pandemic. And I think that will be the outcome of that conversation. I don't see how you look at this evidence and say lockdowns ought to be a tool. And the set of people that had pushed for lockdowns, they got their way. They got their way with illegitimate means, I think, panic mongering. So I think those are old tools. Those are not new. Those are it's often how you win political battles is by creating fear about some boogeyman, and then you rally support around destroying it. That's the Girardian kind of scapegoating idea. I don't think you ever get rid of that, but you can build in institutions. You can build in uh, traditions of knowledge that are widespread in a population that oppose those kinds of ideas and limit the possibility of them coming back. And the human, we start with Solzhenitsyn. I take my favorite quote from him. The line between good and evil cuts through every human heart. It's true. I mean, we're not going to get rid of evil as long as they're humans. We're also not going to get rid of good as long as they're humans. And so all we can really do is try to develop systems so that we can maximize the probability of good coming out into the world rather than the evil that we've seen during the last 2.5 years.
Oh, that's so well said, Jay. And I think as well about Girard, I don't know if you recall how he said the scapegoating mechanism ends. Do you remember?
Well, he's a Christian. I mean, so yeah, he came to Christ actually when he read the Bible. He said, "Look, I can't believe a book like this was ever written. Here's a story where everyone knows that the central hero is being scapegoated."
Yes.
And the very fact of exposure of the futility of the scapegoating mechanism is what undermines it.
That's it. Exactly. So by bringing things to light, as you're saying, by shining light on the dark, right? That's how you get back to the good, because dark is a shadow, right? It's not a life force like good. It's kind of a lack. It's a negative. It's an energy sucker. It's not something that has energy on its own. So you need to just kind of show it for what it is, and then you can actually come back towards the good. And I hope that we're getting to that place. As you said, now on the 2-year anniversary of the Great Barrington Declaration, it appears that maybe you were right after all in this declaration, and there's some kind of victory there, and not in being right, but in that those principles were right all along, or something like that,
Well, I mean, it's a little bit of a cheat cake, I have to say. We just copied the old pandemic plan. Well, thank you, Kate. It was really a great pleasure to talk with you.
Yes, it was so great, and I hope that we can do this again. And I look forward to hearing from our listeners. Let us know what you think. Let us know where you agree, where you disagree, because that, after all, is the nature of debate in what we can try and maintain as the Enlightenment era. Let's not let it be the post-Enlightenment era. Let's hold on to it, and let's reinforce those tenets and keep it going. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Kate.